What is the agreement? The friend. Trey from main D. If this cat is going to be whining in the background, it's going to be so bad. Biggest crime, biggest ambition. Yeah. They can hear us talking through the... Oh.
Babylon is fallen, Christ is risen. Today, we have a very interesting topic. Everybody, welcome to the most wonderful show in the history of the universe, the best show in all of the universe, on Earth, everywhere else. I don't know if aliens do shows or not, but ours is better if they do. Today, we're going to be talking about Pontius Pilate, who is not that important of a character in the Bible, but he is a very important character in the Bible. Something interesting is the fact that in the Nicene Creed, we actually only hear three people mentioned in it. We hear about Jesus, we hear about Mary, and we hear about Pontius Pilate. So, despite the fact that he's not that present in the Gospels, obviously he has a very important role to play in the church and in our ideas that we can get from the Gospels, and specifically in the crucifixion narrative. Before we get started, is there anything you guys want to throw out there?
I'm good. I think we're
Hold
good
on
to
one
go.
second. You guys start. I got to deal with something real quick.
I see. Sure. Uh-oh. Our intro guy.
Let Nate cook, okay? Let him cook. Let him cook, viewers.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is an interesting. Okay, so Trey, do you know what, have you ever talked to Nate about Pontius Pilate before? Like, what provoked him to make this suggestion for a Biff episode?
I'm not sure. I think it's just because it's one of those ambiguous things, and Nate loves the ambiguous stuff in scripture. Um Nate's really into, and so am I, into seeing like in the form of the gospels themselves or in the Bible, like the actual form says stuff about the content, and like you can communicate messages through the form. Like, for example, with the different narratives in what is it, Mark and Matthew? Is it Mark and Matthew with the demoniac and the Gadarenes, where you have the story is all about multiplicity and unity and the relationship between the one and the many, because obviously you have the demoniac who is the one, but then also he's the many, he's legion, right? It's a schizophrenic identity. And you see this sort of schizophrenia in the very form that we're presented with the four gospels, or in this case with the two, because in the one narrative you have one demoniac and then the other one you have two. Now it's not a contradiction, like an actual contradiction, because you can say there's, like Nate was saying, there's a literary technique called spotlighting, where you emphasize one particular thing to the exclusion of others, but just to emphasize that there was one doesn't mean there necessarily wasn't two. um, that's kind of that. But at the same time, there is a point that you can sort of take from this, which is that the very ambiguity of the number of the demoniacs points towards the ambiguity of this sort of schizophrenic identity, the very fact that it is ambiguous in itself. And it's the same with Pilate, because he sort of stands at that, or he is one of those ambiguous characters in the Gospels where we don't really know his fate. He's not, it doesn't seem like he's a Judas, although people in the tradition have wanted to equate him with him. But then he also could be saved, because that's also part of the tradition as well. So there's like a wide variety of opinions on him. So we'll let Nate introduce this and his thoughts on it, and then we'll jump off from there, because he knows the most about this.
Yeah, we're back.
We're back.
We're so back. That was a bit of a chaotic intro, but thank you all
Yeah,
for
all
sticking
good.
with us through the difficulties. We're back better than ever. So, like Trey was saying, there's a lot of ambiguity with the person of Pontius Pilate in the Christian tradition. I mean, even in the gospel presentation of Pilate as an individual, there is kind of an ambiguity to the way that he is presenting himself before Jesus. And it's it's kind of hard to talk about a lot of this stuff because I don't think we're going to have a conclusive answer by the end of this video. If you're looking for something to answer your question that I know everybody has, everybody's begging to know, is Pontius Pilate in heaven? I know that's on everybody's mind. And if you're looking for something to solve that for you, this probably isn't going to do that. But what this is going to do, we're going to go through kind of the basic traditions surrounding Pontius Pilate, the patterns that we see in the traditions about him, and what we can learn from that, and what we can learn from the gospel presentation of Pontius Pilate as a person. So, just to give kind of an overview of the Christian reception of Pilate, the Ethiopians and the Coptics venerate him as a saint, alongside his wife, whom the Eastern Orthodox Church and Eastern Catholics also venerate, but we do not venerate Pontius Pilate as a saint. Some Christians will say just straight up, yeah, he's damned. It's over for him. It never even began for him, truly. But where do we stand in this? And that's what we're going to kind of go through in this video. There's at least some precedence. It should be said right away. There is some precedence in the early communities, either in the church or adjacent to the church, that support a favorable view of Pilate. Kind of the main text that you'll look to when it comes to the Christian reception of Pilate is the Acts of Pilate. There is a pagan version of the Acts of Pilate, but I don't think they exist anymore, and there's probably a reason for that. They're kind of irrelevant. Common pagan L. Sometimes you'll see the Acts of Pilate called the Gospel of Nicodemus, because the author of the Acts of Pilate claims to be Nicodemus himself. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. Everything that I've ever heard has said that it's like obviously not true. I haven't looked at the text myself. I'm not a textual critic. I don't want to be one, so I'm not going to make any comments on the authenticity of any of the texts that we're reading or referencing in this. Just know that the scholarly opinions on pretty much everything we'll be referencing is that they are forgeries, or not forgeries, I guess forgeries, but they're later texts attributed to people from the time of Jesus, or shortly thereafter. So the Gospel of Nicodemus, which is kind of, again, or the Acts of Pilate, which is kind of the main Pilate text that you'll get, shows a more favorable view towards Christ and a less favorable view towards the crowd from the perspective of Pilate. Pilate is kind of forced towards the direction of crucifixion, which is obviously there in the gospel narrative as well, but it makes that very explicit, that Pilate does have this internal desire to save Christ, so to speak, and that it's really just the crowd that's forcing him to do that, which still doesn't really excuse him from allowing it to happen. But then we get into the question of like sins of omission versus sins of commission, which we might be able to talk about a bit later, but let's try to stick to Pilate here. Like I said before, his wife is venerated as a saint in almost all the apostolic churches other than Western Catholicism. Eastern Catholicism venerates her as a saint, which is interesting. And there is actually something I was reading about on a forum earlier with the Eastern Catholic Church in Ethiopia. They still venerate Pilate as a saint, even though they're in communion with the Roman Catholic Church, which does not allow veneration of Pontius Pilate. So that's interesting, but that's also just kind of tangentially related. His wife being a saint is kind of like obvious. I mean, if you look in the Bible, like the one thing we hear about her, the one sentence we have about her is that she had a dream about Christ and that she suffered. It says that she suffered greatly because of this man. And that's literally what sainthood is suffering for Christ. So it's pretty clear that that's something that we can very easily get from just the biblical text, even ignoring the traditions about her. What's not so obvious is Pilate's place in Christendom. We get kind of a split when it comes to literature talking about Pilate after after the Acts of Pilate. Oftentimes you'll hear texts about Pilate referred to as the Pilate cycle, and it's just kind of a bunch of texts that are all about Pilate. Not just about him, but they're all related to Pilate and what ended up happening to him after the crucifixion. There is kind of a split in this literature. We'll get more into this a bit later. But what's very interesting is that initially we see an immediate split between East and West on the question of Pilate. The East has always had a very favorable view of him. And I'm not just talking about like Byzantium as the East. I mean like the Syriacs, Ethiopians, Coptics, like the far East, so to speak. they have a very favorable view of him from the start. I mean, obviously they venerate him as a saint, so yeah. The West has a very negative view of Pilate, generally speaking. It's not a fully negative view towards him. Initially, there is actually kind of a positive attitude towards Pilate in the West, but then it kind of develops into a more negative attitude with that Eastern um, positivity towards him kind of reemerging later on. And I think that that kind of has to do with Roman persecution. I mean, it's hard to view the guy, the Roman politician who was in power when Christ was crucified, positively when you are directly experiencing persecution from that very same government. So it makes sense that the West would have a more negative view towards him. Um, I mean, there's a lot of really bad stuff about Pilate in Western literature. It all kind of starts with Eusebius, who says that he committed suicide, which is kind of like not a good thing to do. And the reason that he says that, I think, is because of the association between Pilate and Judas that you can get from the gospel narrative. In the structure of Matthew 27, there is some poetry or poetic structure being used. And I mean, even in the literary structure of Matthew 27, with just the words themselves being used, there is a very clear connection being made between Pilate and Judas, which we can talk about a bit more later, the specifics of that. But it has to do with the use of the word innocent blood. Judas tries to return his gold or his silver to the temple, and they say, no, we can't, because this was used to shed innocent blood. And Pilate later washes his hands and says, I am not responsible for this innocent blood. So there's an association being made between Judas and Pilate in just the literary structure of Matthew 27. And I think Westerners probably perceived this. And so in the traditional explications of the gospel narrative, Eusebius probably took this association between Pilate and Judas and took it a step further and said, yeah, Pilate, just like Judas, hid away and killed himself. And there's a bunch of narratives that kind of take that and go all sorts of crazy directions. There's this one text in particular called the Mors Pilati. I think that just means the death of Pilate. That it's actually what the Golden Legend quotes when it talks about legends about Pontius Pilate. And I know that, Cole, you are into the Golden Legend, so once you get to the stuff about Pontius Pilate, just know that all of that is coming from this 6th century text, Mors Pilati. And
I will add one
it
thing.
claims that... Okay,
we will be reading the Golden Legend in the VIP book club on the Telos Bound Institute. In about a month's time, the VIP book club will begin. The Golden Legend is in there, so be there. Go on, Nate.
Be there. So yeah, the narrative that the Golden Legend, which we will again be reading in the Telos Bound Institute, for all of you special people, come be our friends. Come read the Golden Legend with us and many other brilliant books. The Golden Legend uses the narrative about Pontius Pilate that he committed suicide and then his body was thrown into the Tiber River. But then through a series of these weird, demonic, spiritual storms that stirred up the water, his body ends up in a lake in Switzerland. And many claim, like to this day, that this lake is Lake Lucerne, where many people allegedly experience all these demonic encounters. And that's kind of a pattern that we'll see in the Western traditions about Pontius Pilate, is that he's very specifically associated with lakes, and in particular lakes that are haunted. So just right there, we kind of see they don't like him in the West very much. I mean, if you're associating him with suicide and places that are haunted, obviously not a guy they like very much. If there's nothing you guys want to add right now, we can just get kind of straight into some of the specifics of the texts themselves, unless there's another direction you guys want to be taking with this. Okay, we'll go ahead.
Keep cooking, bro. Keep cooking.
Okay, so Acts of Pilate, I already kind of talked about it a bit. the Acts of Pilate are definitely the earliest of all of these texts. They're the most likely to be actually authentic, but again, they're probably not from everything that I've heard. What's really interesting is St. Justin Martyr actually talks about in Acts of Pilate in the 2nd century. So there was an Acts of Pilate that probably was authentic, and the one that we have today is like almost 100% related to that. Whether it's exactly the same or not, we have no idea. Nobody knows. But we do know that there was an Acts of Pilate that Christians were reading and were familiar with. So yeah, take that as you will. It's definitely the most popular of the Pilate texts. I mean, if you like look up Pontius Pilate in Christianity, it's the first thing that's going to pop up because it's the least controversial, because it doesn't really present Pilate as good or necessarily bad. It kind of just presents him exactly the way the gospel does. It just kind of takes the gospel narrative about Pilate's trial with Christ, and it just adds some extra conversation in there to make it flow a little smoother. So it's not really a controversial text at all. You can read it, and it just kind of emphasizes the fact that Pilate's in this awkward position where he has the threat of a Jewish revolt about to happen, and he knows that if that happens, he's screwed, because particularly in Judea, there was a history of problematic involvements between the Roman authorities and the Jewish population. So his position as governor was directly at threat during the trial of Christ, with all the Jews saying, hey man, listen, you got to listen to us or we're going to do something. He's like, okay, I've seen where this has gone before. He had some very bad encounters with a few particular Samaritan revolts, which are historically attested to. So it makes sense that Pilate is trying to take as much of a backseat as he possibly can. But in the gospel narrative, Christ is making this harder and harder for him to do, as Jesus does. Jesus does a very good job in the gospel at forcing everybody to choose a side.
Mm-hmm.
But Pilate is kind of like Pilate's kind of the worst example of that pattern in the gospel, because we don't really see him choose a side very explicitly. Like, we can make little assumptions about his psychology at the time, and what his real intentions were when he did stuff, but it's very difficult. Whereas with like everybody else in the Gospels, it's very clear whose side they were on. Like, you were either with Christ or you weren't. Simple as that.
Right. Can I ask a question to you? Because I wouldn't be able to articulate this, but something that Sarah and James Jordan talk about is part of the Second Temple era of Israel's history was the setting up of a Gentile power. It was first, what would the first power be? Babylon, and then I think Persia,
I mean the four
Greece,
beasts
and Rome.
from like Daniel.
Yeah, the four beasts exactly
Yeah.
of Daniel. Yeah. So
yeah,
this
those are them. Yeah.
right. So the final beast, the beast that kind of well, Jordan talks about this, like the Roman Empire is kind of like the beast of all beasts, right? And this isn't necessarily a negative term, right? This doesn't necessarily mean it's a corrupt beast. This is what you get later on in the book of Revelation, because you have Nero and you have the first wave of Roman persecution against the church, which is actually the teaming up of the Jews, the Jewish leaders, and Rome at this time. And there's actually some interesting evidence about a Jewish influence in Nero's court, which is pretty spicy stuff, but there's a lot of evidence for it. So Pilate seems to be at this cusp where he's like, he's not fully corrupted, right? He's not like the beast from the sea in Revelation, which is just like bloodthirsty Nero, this type of corrupted form of the beast. But at the same time, it's not, he's like ambiguous and he's failing to fully do what he's meant to do. And in that way, he's almost a bit like Adam, right? If the beast is meant to guard the bride of Israel, if Pontius Pilate represents, he's a authority in representing the Roman Empire here, and if Jesus is the one man Israel, there seems to be that same pattern here, that Pilate is failing to fully positively, that is properly actualize in his personhood, because again, he represents Roman authorities. So given just the setup that occurs in history, as we read about in Daniel with the 4 beasts. This is the telos, right, of Rome at this time. It's to protect the church, to protect Israel in preparation for the coming of the Messiah. And that's what he seems to fail to do, although not absolutely, it's not an absolute failure. And that's why there seems to be this ambiguity about Pilate.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, like it should be noted that the 4 beasts in Daniel like explicitly become beasts or are explicitly linked with Gentile nations that ultimately do end up protecting Israel throughout their history. And part of the way that we know that is because they are symbolically associated with the beast in Jonah that protected him when he was in the sea. And the whole point of Jonah being eaten by the fish in the sea was because his life was a prophecy. Like the form and the content are not completely different from each other. The form of Jonah's life complements the content of what we read about in his book. He was a prefiguring of what was going to happen to Israel. And that's what we see happen with every prophet. What happened in Isaiah's personal life, he had his tongue touched by the burning hot coal to cleanse his unclean lips because he comes from an unclean people. So there's already that association immediately. But then later in Isaiah, we read, I think it's in Isaiah 27, verse 1, we read that there's a fiery east wind that will come and purge the iniquities of Jacob. So in the life of every prophet, there is this prefiguring of what is going to happen to Israel as a whole. And the same thing happens with Jonah. And the way that we know this is because the fish in Jonah is called a big fish, I think, 3 times, and Nineveh is called a big city 3 times. So, yeah, and Nineveh is also, it should be noted also that Nineveh was converted specifically for the purpose of being able to protect Israel while they were in captivity in the second exile. So yeah, all of this stuff is absolutely right, Trey. And Pontius Pilate does. I just read a comment
Yeah, I know.
that distracted me. Pontius Pilate does, to a degree, do this job as like a righteous Gentile beast from Daniel, where he tries to protect Jesus Christ, but obviously he fails to a degree, at least. Maybe not completely fails, but he fails to a degree. And I think it's important that we note his failure was to a degree the same way his success was to a degree. His success was to a degree. And I mean, that's what we see with kind of everybody in the life of Jesus. Like even Peter failed right at the crucifixion. Everybody ended up departing from Jesus in one way or another, other than like the few that stayed at him with the foot of the cross, right? And that's just because Jesus was the only person who was perfect, and we all have something that we need to be redeemed for, which is very important when we're talking about Pontius Pilate. And this ties into the fact that he's the third person, the one of 3 people mentioned in the Nicene Creed, which we recite all the time. So obviously there's something there where Pontius Pilate kind of represents us, where we are always in this ambiguous position where we have to choose between our internal conflicts and the confrontation of Christ right before our face. And I mean, the question of Pontius Pilate, what is truth? Like, that is the question that we all have to ask every single day, because we have to bear our cross every single day. And every day we're confronted with different difficulties where we have to actively choose between the internal conflicts, whether it's a Jewish rebellion about to rise, causing, your position as governor to be put in jeopardy, or if it's, eating a cheeseburger on a fast day. We have to make these conscious decisions every day on if we're going to act in accordance with our desire to protect Christ, or in our desire to, just not get involved and let all that stuff happen and withdraw ourselves from the
Now,
conflict.
what do you think the question that Pilate asks very famously, what is truth? What do you think this is saying about Pilate and his state? Like, I don't know. I hear a lot of different takes on this, but obviously he's asking this question. Christ himself is the truth. He is the truth right before him, and he's still asking the question, right? So clearly Pilate is missing something. He hasn't fully he isn't fully there if he's asking the question and Jesus is standing right before him. But what are we supposed to take from this? Like, how are we supposed to see Pilate in light of the
Yeah.
fact that it's kind of like this almost absurd situation where the truth is right in front of you and
Yeah.
you're asking, well, what is the truth?
Well, I think it's interesting, first of all, that the answer to what is truth is the crucifixion narrative that follows. Like,
Mm,
Jesus doesn't give a spoken answer to Pilate after he asks that. What happens is Jesus gets crucified. That's truth. The foundation of all truth and all reality is that self-emptying, primarily of God towards creation, but then our participation in that is our self-emptying. And this is why, like, almost all of the Christian narratives that say that Pontius Pilate did end up converting, it had to have been after the crucifixion and the resurrection, because before that he still is in this position where he just doesn't know. And I think that where we can get the idea that he was saved is the fact that Jesus did answer his question of what is truth. The only question is, did he accept that or not? And we don't know from the Bible, because after Jesus answers what is truth with the crucifixion itself, Pontius Pilate isn't a character anymore until we get into apocryphal texts later on. So I think, like, primarily that's what the question is about. But as it relates specifically to the context preceding it, we see it's in the context of the relationship between religion and politics. Because Pontius Pilate says, "Oh, are you a king?" And Jesus says, "Yeah, I'm a king." Or he says, like, "Yeah, but my kingdom is not of this world. It functions on a different plane of existence than your idea of kingship and your idea of rule." And uh, then and then Pontius Pilate, after getting provoked by some more, like, Jewish questions, he's like, "Okay, well, where are you from? Like, what is this? What is this kingdom?" He's a little curious, and Jesus doesn't answer him, and then Pontius Pilate says, "Oh, you're not going to answer me. Don't you know that I have the power to crucify you or the power to release you?" And then Jesus says, "You would have no power unless it was given to you from above." So, and then we get into the what is truth. So, what we're seeing here is Pontius Pilate's entire perception of the way that power and reality functions is getting completely subverted. He's being confronted with the fact that his power is not inherent to the fact that he's just a governor. Power doesn't come from the emperor. Power comes from a step above that. And what's really interesting is when Jesus tells him that power comes from above, he says, "This is why the ones who have delivered you are more at fault." Because it's ultimately the religious authorities that have the most power. Because power comes from God, and the primary way in which we interact with God is through participation in the rituals associated with God, like liturgy, or back then it was, the Jewish rituals. So the fault primarily laid upon the Jews who delivered Christ to Pilate, because they knew that they had the most power, in the most pure definition of the word power, right? The ability to um, enforce something in creation, I guess you could say, because they had direct access to the power and strength of God, but they misused that. Whereas Pilate, he didn't know, he didn't understand that. To him, religion was just like, oh, the emperor is like a son of, the gods and whatever. Go sacrifice your child to Mars or something. Like, he didn't understand what true he didn't understand what true, like, religious power from above was. So when he's asking that, he's being confronted with the fact that the state doesn't have power in and of itself. It only exists in relation to the religious authorities at that time. And this is also what the Tower of Babel says, is that they tried to build a new they tried to build a or they tried to unite everybody in lip and language. And the term for lip is a specifically religious term in the Old Testament. Like, it's used to refer to the ritual prayers and so on and so forth, the interaction between creation and God, whereas language is more of a city, cultural, state thing. So the Tower of Babel tried to not only unite everybody's language, but everybody's religion as well. And that's where they overstepped their boundaries and didn't understand that power comes from above. Your interaction when it comes to politics and whatnot with the world has to be related to and subservient to the interaction between you and God, who is the ultimate source of authority when it comes to everything. We did kind of just go off and go into like all of my notes that I have for what I was hoping to be the second half of this show, and a lot of that was just kind of jumbled thoughts that I have because a lot of those ideas are kind of reliant on the traditions that I was going to go through about Pontius Pilate. So maybe, unless there's more we want to talk about with this, maybe we should go and read through or review a couple more of the traditions and texts that we have.
Yeah, that's good.
Pilate,
You went through what you wanted to like, where you want to end up, and now we're gonna go there. Let's do that.
Yeah. Okay. So the kind of second most popular text in the Pilate cycle is the Anaphora Pilati, or the Report of Pontius Pilate. It's allegedly a letter from Pilate to Tiberius, who was the emperor at the time of Christ's crucifixion. It's also referenced, interestingly enough, by a Christian in the 2nd century. Tertullian claims to have read the original version of it personally. Now, again, just like with the Acts of Pilate, we don't know if the one being referenced is the same as the one we have today. We don't know. But what we do know is that upon reading this, Tertullian said that Pilate had, this is a direct quote, become already a Christian in his conscience. When he read the original letter from Pilate to Tiberius, he says that Pilate had already become a Christian in his conscience. So that's interesting. I think that says a decent amount about things that we can, maybe not 100% accurately, but pretty accurately speculate about how the early Christians perceived Pilate as a person. In the text itself, the text that we have today, which again, we don't know if it's the same one, the letter claims that the Jews were unable to present a single legitimate crime against Jesus to Pilate, and that he only let the crucifixion happen to prevent a rebellion, which, like, that's obvious stuff. That's also in the Acts of Pilate. That's also in the Gospels. Obvious stuff. What's interesting about this text? The letter talks about some very interesting and strange details in the Gospel about what happened after Jesus' death. In the letter, Pilate describing Jesus' death, he describes a supernatural light that shines down on Jerusalem. He describes a series of earthquakes that destroy every single synagogue except for one. And he describes one of the most interesting details in the narrative of the crucifixion, which is the opening up of the earth and the souls from Hades resurrecting and walking around, being seen by many, as it says in the Gospels, which, like, nobody ever talks about that, but it's such a weird detail. Like, what would that have been like? But in this letter, Pilate directly describes that. There's nothing in the letter itself that really, at least the one that we have today, that really says anything about Pilate's personal view of any of this. But again, Tertullian, when he read it, he said that, yeah, Pilate was a Christian. So take that as you will. Obviously, like, there's some controversial stuff with Tertullian, but take that however you want. There's some more text that I think we can just, like, briefly go over that just kind of give some other little interesting ideas about him. There's a letter that's allegedly from Herod to Pilate. So we had one from Pilate to Tiberius. Now we have one from Herod to Pilate. Scholars date it to the 4th century. In it, Herod recognizes his evil deeds. Not Pilate. This is about Herod. Herod recognizes his evil deeds, like beheading John the Baptist. And it gives some really weird details about Herod's daughter, Herodia, as having been strangely beheaded, just like John the Baptist was beheaded. It's almost like a lex talionis, when her mother tries to save her from being taken away by a flood. So, interesting symbolism going on there.
Yeah.
Herod's son is described as having some sort of wasting disease, whatever that means. Herod's wife goes blind, and Herod himself is being afflicted by worms.
Ah.
Interesting. A little plug to one of the episodes we did in the past. I think it was episode 4 or something like that. Go watch that. It's about the worm that shall not die. If you watch that, or if you have watched that, you'll understand why him being afflicted by worms is
Yeah.
such an
Very
interesting
interesting.
detail. What's even more interesting is in this letter, Herod recognizes the kingdom is being handed over to Gentiles, and he requests that Pilate buries him and his family instead of what he calls the already damned priests. So that's interesting. Again, that's not like directly about Pilate, but it's part of the Pilate cycle because Pilate is kind of involved. And I mean, Herod kind of recognizing that he's evil and him asking Pilate to bury him instead, you could kind of take as like him repenting in a way. And you could take that as like Pilate being held in a more positive light, I guess, because he's going to Pilate to bury him instead of the Jews. I don't know. Interesting stuff, to say the least. There's also a letter from Pilate to Herod, which is not related to the letter from Herod to Pilate that I just talked about. And the way that we know it's not related is because there is a very significant difference between them. It's allegedly from the 3rd or 4th century. Again, we really have no clue. Pilate, in this letter, Pilate and his wife Procla, who again is venerated as a saint in almost all apostolic churches, they're both described as converts, as well as the centurion who stabbed Jesus, Longinus, who is also venerated as a saint in, I think, all apostolic churches. Longinus, in the letter from Herod to Pilate, the one that I talked about before this, faces a very odd Promethean sort of judgment where he's eaten by a lion and then resurrected to be eaten by the lion again, to be resurrected, and so on and so forth until the eschaton. Whereas in the letter from Pilate to Herod, he's said to be a saint, like he is in every church. So if we're going to choose between either of those two texts, I'm going to go with the one that's more accurate with the Christian tradition that also happens to say that Pilate also converted. Not saying that he did, but I'm saying if we're going between these two texts, let's go with the one that we know for sure is at least mostly accurate. There are 2 letters in the Pilate cycle, which are kind of, after this, you get into just kind of random nonsense. There's kind of like 3 more important texts in the Pilate cycle, and then it just kind of spreads out into a bunch of random medieval legends. There are 2 letters which were said to have been written between Pilate and Tiberius, both allegedly of medieval authorship. One of which is Pilate writing to Tiberius that Jesus is the most pious man he ever met, and that the crucifixion only happened, again, because he was compelled by the Jews. The letter from Tiberius to Pilate, on the other hand, is very odd and not as positive towards Pilate. It describes Tiberius sending 2,000 Roman soldiers and a courier named Rahab to punish Pilate and the Jews for the crucifixion of Jesus. So it's showing Tiberius on the repentant side of things rather than Pilate. And it ends with Tiberius actually killing Pilate by accident by missing a hunting shot that somehow flies into the prison and kills Pilate. Which is like, obviously that didn't happen, but interesting story.
Yeah.
Those guys had an imagination.
Might be interesting to reflect on the symbolism of some of these stories in more depth at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, if there's anything that like comes to mind while I'm talking, just jump in, because I'm just kind of rambling.
Doesn't that, we talked about Cain, right? We talked about Cain last time, and there is a tradition that Cain was killed by accident too, by like a stray arrow, right? Like from, like that's one of the traditions about Cain's death, is that he died from a stray arrow, because who was it that was hunting that thought he was an animal and shot him?
I would think I'm not 100%. I've heard this before, but I think it's Lamech. Yeah, and I mean, like the one about Herod saying that he's being afflicted by worms and his daughter was weirdly beheaded while a flood was taking her and her mom was trying to save her. Like that's so symbolically rich, and that's also one of the earliest texts we have that's related to Pilate and Herod. So that one would be interesting to kind of analyze, obviously knowing that it's like probably not real, but still the symbolic importance is there when we're talking about it because this is an attitude that at least some early Christians had about these characters. There's one more text I want to go over. Bear with me, everybody. This might be boring to all of you, but
It's
you
not.
can
It's
get some
lit.
interesting stuff
And if
out
you
of
think
this.
it's boring, you're wrong. It's lit.
This is true. This is true. Don't forget, we are the number one show in the universe. Who else is talking about Pontius Pilate and being afflicted by worms? Anyways, the narrative of Joseph of Arimathea is the last text that I kind of want to go over a little here. Joseph is the guy who asked to bury Jesus in his tomb in the gospel. Real guy. This text is just attributed to him. But every scholar says it's just a Greek medieval legend. Who knows? Who knows for sure? I don't trust scholars just immediately. And I know probably everybody watching also doesn't just trust the consensus of scholars when it comes to dating things related to Christianity for a good reason. It's less about Pilate himself, but it gives a really interesting explication of the story of Demas and Justus, the two thieves that were crucified with Jesus. Justus is an absolute weirdo in this narrative. He is a psycho. He kills people on the highway, robs people, and he drinks baby blood. So he's a bit of a Looney Tune.
As one does. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. Well, I mean, like, what else are you gonna do in the middle of nowhere in Judea
Common
in
pastime.
like 0 BC? Yeah.
Yeah.
So he was a weirdo. Damas, on the other hand, was like almost like Robin Hood. He stole from corrupt powers in order to give to the poor. One of the corrupt powers that he stole from happened to be the Jews at the time, like the Pharisees, the people who overran or who kind of ran things back then. Where this connects to Jesus is Damas is given an interesting story where he stole the law of the Jews. He goes into the temple and steals the law. He also, this is really weird, he also stole the clothing of Caiaphas's daughter for some reason. And she convinces Caiaphas that if Jesus is destroyed, the law will be rediscovered. So I don't really know what to make of that. That's something that probably does have some interesting symbolic significance to it, but I don't really know what to make of that. That's beyond me. Jesus is charged because of Caiaphas's daughter, saying that Jesus is charged with stealing the law. And on the cross, Damas repents for his sins. Just like in the gospel, he repents for his sins, he joins himself to Jesus' crucifixion, and Justus says that if he had known Jesus was a king, he would have tried to kill him too. So yeah, Justus, not a very good guy. I mean, drinking the blood of babies, saying that he would have killed Jesus himself if he wanted to. Kind of weird stuff. But what is interesting is the association between Damas stealing the law, whatever that means, and Jesus being accused of stealing the law, because Jesus kind of did steal the law in a sense. Jesus came and he was healing people on the Sabbath. He was doing all this stuff that was showing like the law isn't just for itself. The law exists to serve me. I'm the reason you guys had the law. Like I can do with the law what I want. It's about me. So there's a sense in which he did steal the law, but it's through him stealing the law that people like Damas were able to be redeemed.
This very much reminds me of the Ethiopian tradition. It's in the Kebra Nagast, which is the kind of Ethiopian chronicle about their history dating back to Solomon and whatever. But the narrative about stealing the Ark of the Covenant that is in the Ethiopian tradition very much seems very similar.
Yeah.
And also,
there's definitely something you can make of that.
There's something to do. Okay, so Ethiopia is this. It's the edge. It's the peripheral place. If you haven't seen Jonathan Pajot and Richard Rowland's stuff on Ethiopia, you really should check it out because it's excellent. But it relates directly to the question of Pontius Pilate, because the symbolism of Ethiopia is like this container, right? It catches the things which fall out of the frame and contains them and keeps them and stores them. So it's like a kind of symbolic, treasure trove or like refrigerator or something. So you have all these ancient texts like the Book of Enoch that get preserved in the Ethiopian tradition. And you have all these particular hagiographies that seem to relate to the periphery and collecting the edge and kind of accumulating things that are shed. And this seems to make perfect sense in light of this conversation, because they're the ones who have Pilate as a saint. So when he fell out of the tradition elsewhere, he gets preserved in Ethiopia because they just kind of gobble everything up. So they have the Ark of the Covenant. They have all these Jewish practices, which are like these remnants. They're these leftover things. So they still practice circumcision and baptism. Like they have all these. They don't eat pork, So there's this aspect to Ethiopia that seems to totally compute when you're like, oh yeah, they have Pontius Pilate as a saint. Like all the weird liminal things they preserve.
Yeah. And I mean, like the Catholic Church in Ethiopia, from what I understand, was trying to like kind of oppress a lot of the stuff that's happening there, but it's not working too well. I mean, Ethiopians are hard to tame, man. You can't take their veneration of Pontius Pilate away from them as they're learning right now. So yeah, that's a really good insight. Something interesting to note is that a lot of the Christian traditions about Pilate come from responses from early church fathers or earlier church fathers to a certain pagan by the name of Celsus. Celsus, I mean, the original text that he wrote against Christians, I don't think anybody has access to it anymore, but scholars can basically like reconstruct the arguments that he was laying out based off of.
It's only
how
preserved in
Christians
Origen's
quoted it.
Contra Celsum, yeah.
Yeah.
Which we're going to read also in the VIP book club. Everyone sign up for that.
Yet another seamless plug by Cole. Everybody join. Be our friends. Origen, funny enough you brought him up. Origen gives a bit of a weird response to Celsus, because what Celsus says is that if the Christian God is true, how is it that Pilate didn't receive any divine retribution for his crucifixion of God incarnate? Because I mean, in the pagan ideas about God, there were like incarnate gods, and anytime someone tried to mess with that, they would face a very severe divine retribution. I think Celsus like explicitly mentions Dionysius and him getting back at the king of somewhere for like saying Dionysius sucks.
Yeah, it's in the Bacchae. It's in the Bacchae, yeah.
Yeah.
And you have these stories like, and this comes up in the New Testament when I think is it Paul and Barnabas who go to a town in Asia Minor, and the people come out to like basically offer sacrifices to them. Yeah, that's because that's playing on this tradition of Zeus and Hermes going to a particular city. I really wish I could remember the name of the city. And they're not shown proper hospitality, so they like blow that shit to smithereens, right? That's kind of the mindset that Celsus is working with, obviously.
Yeah. And Origen gives a pretty interesting response to this, which is one of the directions that we see, which it's kind of like the overarching narrative that we see about Pontius Pilate in the Christian traditions. Origen answers by saying that Pilate didn't receive divine retribution because it was the Jews' fault. They're ultimately the ones who are responsible for crucifying Christ. And I mean, Christ himself says something kind of like that when he's talking to Pilate. He's the ones who delivered me to you are more at fault. So like that's in the gospel.
It's the whole structure of the Gospel of John. The entire Gospel of John is structured like a court scene, basically, where this is something that Peter Lightheart talks about in House for My Name. And of course, obviously, the dramatic reversal is that they put Yahweh on trial, but you can't put Yahweh on trial. He's the judge. So it's the reversal that the very one who is judged becomes the justified one, who then is raised up to the heavens and ends up being the judge. And maybe this is something we should touch on, is this whole, I mean, with the crucifixion, it's all about the reversals and the ironies and the way in which unintentionally everyone in the story no matter what position they take, glorify Christ in some way. It's like, and a part of this has to do with obviously Pontius Pilate. Pilate he gives Christ the title King of the Jews, right? And then the Jews are mad about this, and he says, like, I wrote what I wrote, right? And part of this, if you're reading it, well, this is something that Lightheart also mentions, is that Pilate fails to be a true governor here. Like, if he was a true governor, he would have been able to act on his knowledge that this was unjust. He knew it was unjust what was happening to Christ, but he failed to act on it. He's not the one actively advocating for the death of Christ the way the Jews are, and this is why they're more at fault. And also, they're the ones who received the scriptures and the revelation. They were meant to be the ones who embrace their Messiah, except but they crucify him. But I mean, by crowning Jesus as the King of the Jews, because the Jews are actually in the scene, also the ones who are clearly controlling Pilate, right? Pilate's being controlled by the Jews, and Christ is the King of the Jews. Well, then who out of all three of these characters is the boss, like the top person here? Who's the top G here? It's Christ, because he's the King of the Jews. The Jews are influencing, taking control of the Roman Empire at this point. And yeah, and that's because Pilate is basically failing to act as a governor. Like he doesn't really, he's scared. He is under pressure from this Jewish mob, and that's one of the reversals there. So maybe we can talk a bit about the Christian reversals that we see in this story, and the way in which unintentionally the behavior of Pilate and the Roman soldiers who are guarding Jesus, and also the Jews themselves, it's all reversed. What their intentions were, they meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, right? That's a quote from
Genesis
from
50:20.
Genesis. Yeah.
My I have a really good quote from St. Augustine that goes basically into everything you just said and kind of ties it all together. It's a long quote, so bear with me for a bit. But
Bearing.
this is I just pressed something. This is from his 201st sermon in I think it's the Shaft series on the Church Fathers. Hold on, my Discord is
We're gonna read up from 1 to 201. So
yes. So
get
bear
ready.
with us here. It's gonna take about a week. Thus it is that Pilate too was certainly breathed upon by some light air of truth, when during Christ's passion he wrote the title the King of the Jews, which the incorrigible Jews attempted to correct. He answered them, "What I've written, because it had been foretold in the psalm, do not corrupt the inscription of the title." And so let us pay the closest attention to this great and wonderful sacrament or significant act. The Magi were from the Gentiles, Pilate too was a Gentile. They saw a star in the sky, he wrote a title on the tree. Both, however, were looking for or acknowledging the king, not of the Gentiles, but of the Jews. Thus already there is a prefiguring of what the Lord himself spoke about later. Many will come from the east and the west and sit down with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, but the children of the kingdom will go out into outer darkness. That's Matthew 8:11-12. The Magi, you see, had come from the east, Pilate from the west. So they bore witness to the King of the Jews rising, that is, to his being born. He to the King of the Jews setting, that is, to his dying, so that they might take their seats in the kingdom of heaven with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, from whom the Jews derived their descent. They weren't descended from them, of course, in the flesh, but grafted into them by faith. Thus the wild olive the apostle talks about, that was to be grafted into the olive, was already being prefigured. That's why it was the King of the Jews, not of the Gentiles, who was either being for or being acknowledged by these same Gentiles, because the wild olive was going to come to the olive tree, not the olive tree to the wild olive. And yet the branches that were due to be broken off, that is, the unbelieving Jews, both answered the Magi's inquiry where the Christ would be born in Bethlehem of Judah, that's Matthew 2:5, and also with insistent savagery overbore Pilate when he remonstrated them for wanting to crucify their king. And so the Magi worshipped him when the Jews showed them the place where Christ was born, because it's in the scriptures which the Jews have received that we get to know Christ. Pilate from among the Gentiles washed his hands when the Jews were demanding the death of Christ, because it is with the blood of Christ, which the Jews shed, that we have washed away our sins. But there's another time and place for discussing Pilate's testimony by the title, in which he wrote that Christ is the King of the Jews, the time of the Passion. The Jews carry around the divine testimonies not for their own, but for the Gentile salvation and acceptance. Interesting stuff there that kind of ties together everything you just said. There is a pattern in the Bible about the firstborn and the secondborn. The Jews primarily symbolizing the firstborn and the Gentiles symbolizing the second. Well, first of all, the Gentiles symbolize the firstborn, and then the Jews represent the secondborn, because the firstborn is kind of like the bad guy who, takes his responsibility as the firstborn and goes crazy with it, like the Gentiles in the lineage of the Gentiles. I mean, that we first see that in Cain and Abel. Cain is the firstborn who goes crazy. Abel, the secondborn, dies and then is symbolically resurrected in the person of Seth, who then carries on the righteous line. And we see that in Esau and Jacob. Esau goes kind of crazy as the firstborn. Jacob ends up redeeming Esau. At the end, we see them reunite with each other. They weep on each other's necks. And the language for weeping on each other's necks, we also see in the story of Joseph and his brothers, where Joseph is cast out by the older brothers, and then they're ultimately reunited later on. So first and foremost in the Bible, we see that the firstborn represents the pagans, the Gentiles, and then the secondborn represents the Jews who are supposed to redeem them.
And this is well attested in Jewish literature. They make this association of Rome with Edom, with Esau. And that makes total sense given this story, right? So okay, so there's some irony going on here. Okay, so you have Esau, right? And we talked about this in the last episode, how he is this kind of he's the outer man, right? He's covered in hair, which is this dead thing that's at the edge of your being. He gives into his passions, right? He exchanges his birthright for a mess of pottage, right? To sate his hunger. And so he kind of gives way to his kind of lower aspects. And I mean, that's exactly what Pilate does, right? He is the governor of Judea, and there's the grumbling Jewish populace that says, crucify him, and he gives into that. It's the same thing. It makes total sense, actually. This just dawned on me right now. But the connection with Rome and Edom, and the fact that Pontius Pilate is the representative of Rome in this particular narrative of the trial of Christ, it makes total sense. But here's the interesting thing, though. So Edom loses his birthright in basically attending to the lower aspects at the expense of the higher aspect. But it seems that Pontius Pilate and the Rome that he represents wins the birthright, because Christ goes to the Gentiles, and the Gentiles are exalted over the Jews. They destroy Judea. So what's going on here? It seems like, okay, the Edom symbolism lines up with Pontius Pilate just well, perfectly. Boom. But there's this weird flip where he wins, Rome wins.
Yeah. Yes, that's 100% right. St. Cyril of Alexandria says this exact same thing in his commentary on the 12 minor prophets. He says that there is this flip that happens with Jesus Christ, where, and I mean, Paul himself talks about this in Galatians and other places as well. He, specifically in Galatians 4, he associates the church with Isaac, the secondborn, who was the true firstborn, so to speak, and he associates the Jews with Ishmael. So already in Paul, we see that there's a very explicit awareness of the fact that there's this flip that happens where the Jews no longer represent Isaac. They no longer represent Abel. They no longer represent Jacob. The church is the secondborn who redeems the first, and the Jews have become like the wicked firstborn, like the wicked Gentiles who once persecuted them. And this is just the entire narrative of the gospel is so infused with this idea of Israel becoming like the Gentiles, and Christ becomes the secondborn. And this goes into Cain and Abel and Seth, where Cain kills Abel. Abel is resurrected symbolically as Seth, who then redeems humanity through Noah. Excuse me. And we see that in the sense that Israel is the secondborn, and then they die. I mean, they die very voluntarily by becoming like the firstborn. But then there's the resurrection of the secondborn into the person of Seth, who is ultimately representing Jesus Christ, who is that resurrection of the secondborn, who comes and shows, no, guys, this is about me. All of this was just prefiguring your salvation in me. And so St. Cyril of Alexandria talks about this, where the Jews, I think he talks about it in his commentary on Obadiah specifically, if you guys want to like double check this to see if I'm just like making stuff up. I'm not. He talks about how Edom now represents the Jews, and the task of the church is now what originally the task of Israel was, which is to bring the gospel, to bring the light of God to the Gentiles. It's now our job as the church to bring the light of God to the Jews. So there is this weird reversal that happens in all of this. And like, it's strange. It's so strange, but it's so cool.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem like you're right. It's not just like Edom. Like I laid out how Edom is the firstborn and relates to Rome being the firstborn, and this is in Jewish tradition too, and in biblical symbolism. But it's also Cain too, because Christ redeems Cain in the sense that, like, we call the Eucharist the unbloodied sacrifice, right? I mean,
which is what Cain tried to offer.
Which is what Cain tried to offer. So
yeah, exactly. I mean, all the firstborn, secondborn symbolism comes from Cain and Abel. We have Cain kills the secondborn. He was supposed to be his brother's keeper. When he asks, "What am I, my brother's keeper?" Yes, dude, you're his older brother. You're supposed to take care of him. And then Abel is resurrected symbolically in the person of Seth. So this sets the precedent for what the firstborn and secondborn symbolism is, which is what all of Genesis is about. We see it start with Cain and Abel, and we see it end with Joseph, who very, very perfectly summarizes his symbolism in himself, not fully, because it fully happens in Jesus Christ. And what's interesting is the one firstborn, secondborn relationship that we see that is not mended by the end of their narrative. We see Isaac and Ishmael, they come together again to bury their father. Esau and Jacob, they weep on each other's necks. Joseph and his brothers, they weep on each other's necks. All of the stories of the firstborn and the secondborn have this redemption and reunion other than Cain and Abel. And the reason for that is because the first murder is fixed and redeemed by the last murder, so to speak, the murder of Jesus Christ. So we don't see that first story of the younger and the older, or the older and the younger. My body language was in discord with my words there, and it threw off my train of thought. The older and the younger, the first instance of that coming into conflict, we don't see solved and resolved until Jesus Christ. And it's in Jesus Christ that we see this weird flip happen of the older and the brother, or of the older and the younger, where now the Jews are no longer the young who are responsible for redeeming the older. It's the church that's the younger brother that's now responsible for redeeming the older brother, who is the Jews, as Paul very explicitly lays out in Galatians 4. St. Cyril also very explicitly lays it out in his commentary on the 12 prophets. Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah, unless there are any last comments, I
I
think it's about time for our transition.
Yeah, we can transition for sure.
Yes.
But that's interesting. Like, Father Joseph Lucas and Pajot recently talked about Saint Cyril of Alexandria's thoughts on Genesis recently. I mean, we read him for his Christology, right? Like, you know, in the unity of the person of Christ and whatnot. But I feel like maybe Saint Cyril is an underrated like exegete and commenter on Scripture. I think maybe more people should attend to that side of his corpus.
Yes.
There's a lot. I remember listening to the Pajot talk about Saint Cyril, and I was like, I've been sleeping on Saint Cyril. We can announce it here. We're working on a big, large volume, a collection of Church Father quotes, huge, on the communal ontology. So we're going to be finding all the passages from the Church Father where they talk about metaphysics and ontology, specifically from a communal perspective, that is understanding that identity is not self-relation but communion, and identity consists of the union of a self and another in a third, ultimately. But we've already
there were two more things that I just had replanted in my mind that I wanted to talk about a bit earlier in here, but got kind of thrown off track. I'm very tired, so my whole train of thought this stream has been very scattered. I'm trying my best to stay composed for you guys. Pilate, in like almost all of the literature we see, and I mean this is also in the Christian tradition, again, his wife is venerated as a saint, so it would make sense that in the traditions about Pontius Pilate being redeemed, it's through the conversion of his wife initially that we see him being redeemed. That sounds a bit similar to a story of another particular Roman politician that we see convert to Christianity later on. Constantine is converted by his mother. That feminine principle in their life is the first to recognize it, and then it's out of the womb, so to speak, of the feminine that the masculine then says, oh, okay, I'm going to enter this. I'm going to accept this body that's being given to me, and I'm going to go for this. So
it's the same with Augustine and his mother.
Exactly.
And maybe that's one of the psychological reasons why Augustine, despite being a Westerner, seemed to have an affinity with Pilate. Maybe he saw himself in Pilate there a bit.
We all should see ourselves in Pilate, because again, there's a reason he's one of 3 people mentioned in the Nicene Creed. Where we hear about Jesus, we hear about Mary, and we hear about Pilate. And I think there are some very interesting implications that can be made about this on like things to do with salvation that I don't want to talk about too much on this stream. But yeah, we definitely have to see ourselves in Pilate, because Pilate is being confronted with what we get confronted with every day. Jesus is right in front of our faces. Like if we really try to look for it, we see Jesus everywhere. But we also have all these other distractions going on, like Jewish revolts. I mean, like I just had to suppress a Jewish revolt the other day, and now my position as governor is in jeopardy. It's like, it sucks, man. But we got to take this.
I've been having to deal with so many Jewish revolts recently. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
And I have been playing a lot of Total War, but it's unrelated. But no, man, it's crazy.
It is crazy. What's even crazier, though, is how easy it is to just give ourselves to Christ and let him solve all that for us. We don't need to get distracted by all these Jewish revolts. We don't need to get distracted by the mean emperor trying to take away our position as governor because we mishandled the Jewish revolts. We just got to trust in Jesus Christ. And we gotta wash ourselves in the blood, which St. Augustine says that Pilate's washing of his hands was symbolic of baptism, which is interesting. That puts a whole different spin on a lot of the thoughts that people have about Pilate, where it's like, oh, him washing his hands is just him being a coward. Maybe not. I don't know.
Well, I think that's another part of the irony that's in this story. Like, let his blood be upon us and upon our children. But he is the goat for the Lord from the Day of Atonement, whose blood cleanses the camp. So, like, you say basically, we'll deal with the consequences, but you don't realize what the implication of that is. And it's the same thing with Pilate saying, I'm not going to deal with the consequences. And it's like, yeah, you don't. Like, it's like, yes, you do have to deal with the consequences, and it's better than you thought it would turn out. And you don't want to deal with the consequences, and it's better than you thought it would turn out. Because we're redeeming the firstborn, dude. We're redeeming Cain. Okay, we're redeeming Cain here. That's the business we're up on.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, it's in the person of Jesus Christ, and I'm going to say this, and this might sound a little weird, but it's in the person of Jesus Christ that the 2 other people in the Nicene Creed find union with each other. It's in the person of Jesus Christ that Mary and Pontius Pilate are brought into union. And I think that's a good place to end.
Yeah. Yep. Just end on a very enigmatic statement.
Yeah.
To confuse people.
Yeah, so we'll yep.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yep. So we are going into the transition now. So now we've started doing the post-show hangouts. So if you want to become part of these weekly post-show hangouts where you can just join us live and ask questions and talk, you can become a part of the Telos Bound Institute. Now, you're saying, I don't want to pay to get into the Telos Bound Institute. Well, I'm going to be giving out some free 1 week, 7-day long free trials soon. I don't know how I'm going to do it, probably with people who email me directly. So you could just email me and ask me about that, and I'll probably send it to you. and we'll just set you up in there for a week, and then if you decide you want to stay, then we can do that. Yeah,
If
then
you decide not to stay, you're banned for life.
yeah,
just
yeah,
so
you're
you
just
know.
gone. Yeah, you're put on a blacklist. You're considered as part of the Jewish revolt, and you're we're gonna get debanked. But anyway, so we're gonna go on to Lore Coffee Roaster ad right now, and then after that, we have our post-show hangout. Also, we have super chats. We're answering super chats guaranteed. Stream elements tips guaranteed, and also just leave a question and we'll probably get to it because no one ever super chats except for. So I don't want to say that because it kind of diminishes our great super chatters, our great super chatter, or 2 or 3 of them. But we do have a bunch of people in the Discord right now. We have 7 people in the audience, which you can't see.
7 million.
7 million. Sorry, yeah, 6 million. And that. So we'll go to the lore ad now.
Most excellent. Okay, Lorad, get in
Million,
here.
huh?
Boom.
For a long time, we've been looking for a company to sponsor Telos Bound that not only delivers a product or service we would be excited to share with you guys, but also aligns with our values and goals. After many months of searching, we finally discovered Lore Coffee Roasters. Lore is owned and operated by 2 young Orthodox Christian families, striving to give glory to God by treating their craft with respect and serving excellent coffee to everyone. They operate in the subsect of the coffee industry known as specialty coffee, meaning they source the highest grade coffee grown and processed by expert farmers and producers from around the world. Lore then pays homage to their craft by delicately roasting every coffee to optimum flavor, clarity, and distinctness, revealing the essence, or perhaps if you're Orthodox, you'd want to say the energies of every coffee. They have a subscription platform on their website, making it easy for you to choose your coffee, how much of it you would like, and how often you want it delivered right to your doorstep. They ship across America and internationally as well. Above all things, the families behind Lore are striving to glorify Christ and serve his holy church in everything they do, and we at Telos Bound can get behind that. So thank you so much to Lore for the great work that they do and for supporting Telos Bound. Please consider supporting them and us by using the link in the description to purchase your coffee.
Jewish revolts.
He's back. He's muted.
We're
They
back.
muted him.
We're back. We're
They
back.
muted him.
Just had to put down a Jewish revolt. I'm back though. Okay, before we get our boys in here, and by the way, Trey, I think I got added in the stage text chat, but I can't check that without throwing off the screen share.
Right.
So you'll just have to tell me
Gotcha.
what people were asking me. But I wanna advertise more extensively real quick the Telos Bound Institute, because I really think it is going to be a dope place. Like, already the conversations that are taking place in the Telos Bound Institute are extremely high IQ. Like, basically all the high IQ users from the open to general audience Telos Bound server are in here, and they're having some great conversations about really heavy topics. And it's just going to be awesome because basically we're going to have a number of things in place. So I think the mainstay of this, well, for one, if you want to have access to like us and Sarah from Hamilton, like the best way to do it is through the Institute. I think we negotiated that with Sarah, and like he's going to be hopefully most available on the Telos Bound Institute. So that's one. But 2, also, this VIB book club is going to be dope because we're going to be going through like 2,000 years worth of theology, starting from like the Gospel of John and going to like Staniloi, and it's just going to be great. We're
doing everything, man.
We're doing everything. I've meticulously been constructing this 101 book list for the Telos Bound Institute VIP book club, and it's gonna cover like the broad swath of like everything that's going on. But also, over the course of church history, but also it's going to accentuate certain things you wouldn't normally get accentuated. So we're going to do like Augustine's Psalm commentary and like Richard of St. Victor, Ariagena, It's just going to be dope. So make sure you get in
Wild
there.
stuff.
And Trey, what is the lowest tier on the Patreon that people can get into the institute cost? Is it 10?
$5.
Five.
$5 is the lowest tier, so it's only $5. But if you email us at telosbound@gmail.com, I will send you a 7-day free trial or whatever. It's a common thing that people do, whatever, with paid communities. But yeah, because we just want to get people in the server who are actually interested. It's not just about grifting people for money. It's like really low, obviously, because we're spending a lot of time in this, right? So it's kind of necessary, but also we want like a filter to make sure the people who are joining actually are joining. So it's not like the other server, which I've distanced myself from. I love that server. I had a great time in there, but now we're focusing on the Institute. But yeah, so there's an exclusive offer for Babylon is Fallen watchers, free 7-day trial into the Institute. Then next week, because it's 7 days, you'll also get access to, or you'll be able to participate in our next BIF, Babylon is Fallen post-show hangout. But yeah, so we actually have Jonathan politely waiting. Oh, you guys can see him, yeah, waiting to talk right now. We have 7 people watching, and that could be you if you just email us, or if you just want to right away support us on Patreon. It's any tier above the first one gets you access to the Institute server. We're just starting. Huge plans.
Huge.
Yeah.
Hey guys, how's it going?
What's up,
Hey,
Jonathan?
Jonathan.
So, I just had kind of like a speculative thought. I know that there's like historical attestation, I think in Josephus, that says that Pilate basically got sentenced uh, for actually violently suppressing an armed Samaritan group, which another historian, I think, uh, basically said it's likely that they were being led by a would-be Messiah named Dositheus.
Yeah.
And if that's true, if all that's true, and as an aside, I think they were like apparently looking for relics like associated with Moses or something. But uh, it there's an irony there, because when Pilate sort of tries to appease the Jews by crucifying Christ, right? Like that's the way he's trying to like quell the revolt or the potential revolt. But then later there's this would-be Messiah that he actually tries to use the other option of violently quelling, the revolt. And there's an irony there, because if he had done that and sort of protected Christ, then he potentially would have died for Christ in that first go round. And then later, after he missed his opportunity to die for Christ, and his second go round with the other violent revolt, he sort of, dies for something kind of pointless. He dies for a would-be Messiah, so to speak, or,
Yeah.
associated with that. I just thought that was an interesting sort of parallel there, or irony.
Yeah, you
True,
die either
but,
way. You only get to choose whether or not you die for the right
Yeah.
thing. Yeah, die with Christ.
right.
Yeah.
I think you could also spin it. I think your reading is more accurate, but I think you could also spin it the other way, where it's like he saw what happened when he just washed his hands and stepped away, and he was like, okay, I can't do that again. I gotta get involved this time. It's just that the time that he did get involved,
Yeah,
pointless.
it was the wrong Messiah,
Yeah.
or something like that.
Wrong
So
guy.
yeah, but that was just my thought. I didn't know if that was.
No,
I
yeah,
don't know how plausible these various historical, traditions are, but
that's really cool. I heard about the Samaritan revolt very like vaguely in some of my research that I was doing on Pilate. But I never thought to make that connection. That's really insightful.
yeah, thanks. And it was really cool. Like this episode was really cool. I felt like there were all these different threads that just sort of got woven together, and it's one of the things I like about what you guys do here. So
You're
Well,
too
thank you.
kind,
Can't do it without
Jonathan.
you.
And we're really happy to
All right,
have you.
I'll let-
Jonathan is another one of these high
Cool.
IQ users that just joined. Like as soon as we announced the Telespan Institute, he's going to be. You can hang out with him and other baller individuals if you join. Nate, I want to ask you about where do the Samaritans fit into this firstborn, secondborn dialectic that we've been discussing? Do you not know? No clue.
God knows.
That's a cop
I
out.
do not.
That's a cop out, but okay.
You're fired. Get out. Leave.
Sorry, guys, I gotta go.
Huge, huge, huge.
I have no idea, honestly. That's something that I've not like intentionally avoided looking into, but it's just I haven't looked into the place of like the Samaritans in all of this kind of at all yet, because they're kind of like these weird hybrid sort of marginal people. So I think that my intuition, not really knowing the details about it, is just that they exist sort of for the purpose of blurring the boundaries. They exist for the purpose of, in a way, opening up the possibility for a bridge there to be built. And I mean, if we're going that route, I don't think it's a coincidence at all. Well, I don't believe in coincidences at all, period. I don't think any of us do. You shouldn't. There's no such thing as a coincidence.
Unless
There's
you
just-
mean things coincide, but
Yeah.
intentionally, providentially.
yeah, exactly.
Providential
The
coincidence.
word coincidence is just missing the God part of it.
Hmm.
Uh,
There are no coincidences. Stoic pilled. That's true.
yeah, there are no coincidences.
Yeah, it's also from Kung Fu Panda.
This is true. Kung
Yeah.
Fu
The
Panda
two
is
great
communal
sources
play.
of wisdom in the world, Kung Fu Panda and the Stoic tradition of philosophy. That's all you need, ladies
Yeah.
and gentlemen.
Fulfilled in the communal ontology. Just wraps it all together.
This is
Yeah.
true.
And Wu just joined to say nothing. Welcome, Wu.
It's most excellent. Most excellent, Woody Woo. Yo, Nate, I know we got other people wanting, but I want to say this real quick about something. So you said we should put ourselves in the place of Pilate. We put ourselves in the place of the three people who are named in the creed, right? Of Christ, right? That's obvious. Of the Virgin, right? Who's the church? Who's creation? She's all of these things. She's Israel. And then Pilate. I think you're definitely onto something. That's very interesting because, I mean, you are faced with the same situation Pilate is in every day. If you could only see it, I mean, he who, if you've, what you do to the least of these, you've done to me. So, to use some, I guess, Bulgakovian language, like, God is the I am that I am behind every I that is, right? So, when you encounter any person, and you are rationalizing why you can't attend to that person and do right by them on the grounds of some kind of harm to yourself, you are doing exactly what Pilate did, because you are neglecting Christ, who is right in front of you, in favor of your own self. Because, yeah, like what you've done to the least of these, you've done to me. So you meet Christ every day. You're just blind to it. We all are. Yeah.
On the note of us being like Pilate, I think something else we can learn from that is from the very fact that there is this ambiguity about the person of Pilate in the Christian tradition, not to the detriment of him, but in my opinion, to the possible redemption of him. We need to realize, like, even though we are partly responsible for, we are responsible for reenacting the crucifixion of Christ every day. Like, we re-crucify Christ every time we sin, whether that's by omission, like Pilate, or by commission, like the other guys. We are responsible for that, but despite that, there still exists the possibility for our redemption in the church and joining ourselves to the church's tradition and to the church's, ability to take these things, bring it to Christ, and redeem it.
Amen.
100%. What's up, Marcus?
We have Marcus. We have Evan too. I don't know who was first, but I know if I say that now, it's just going to be confusing. You guys decide. Evan was first. Oh wow! Look at this humility here. Evan goes, "I'll let Marcus." Marcus goes, "Evan was first." we're just too humble here. Well, I'll make the decision then, Evan, because he was first. So Evan, I think he had a question that was different, but that's okay. That's okay. It's not necessarily on topic, I think, but it's one of those questions that I like.
Trey, haven't you read that the
Trinitarian
first will be last and the last will be first, though? So
I have read that. I lined up last for communion last week, and
Felt pretty good
old
about
man
yourself.
tapped on my shoulder. No, well, yeah, old man tapped on my shoulder and said that. And I was like, yeah, that's me. Yeah, okay. So Evan, what's up, man? Thanks for joining.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yep, you're good.
yep.
All right. So yeah, no, I don't have anything on topic to Pilate, unfortunately, but I had broached this sort of earlier with Trey, because he's recently mentioned he believed in the logical argumentation for the Trinity and mentioned Richard of Saint Victor, and that got my mental juices flowing. So I just thought, well, we have the opportunity here. I'll bring up more fully because um, just trying to think how to put it.
They're always tough. Trinitarian questions.
Right. I suppose just the reason why I have a personal interest in it is because, well, one, we both share a common interest in philosophy. We know we can help illuminate a lot of wonderful mysteries about the faith. And I also think, I mean, speaking from an apologetic stance, it's also really good to have argumentation, because if someone asks, well, why the Trinity, I think it just makes sense to have a sort of way to reason about that. And I suppose what I'm just trying to get at is how you would approach that, how you would think about that. And before you guys answer that, I'll just say how I would approach that. And it's kind of interesting because, Trey, I mentioned to you earlier David Bradshaw and Richard Swinburne's book on natural theology. And when I had read that, I was still already thinking about these sort of issues and like how to logically go about it. And in let me try and find it. In the book, in Richard Cross's chapter, there is a little section on what Richard of St. Victor argues. And I'm going to read from that now if you don't mind. But what they say is, Richard of St. Victor, for instance, in the 12th century, accepts a version of Anselm's ontological argument, and thence derives an argument for the Trinity on the basis of perfect being considerations. God's goodness entails God's lovingness, but love requires a subject to love and a subject to be loved. And in the case of supreme love, these subjects must be equal. And the supreme love requires that these two are united in their love for a third. And this, mutual and shared love, exhausts the varieties of love. But there is only one God, since there can only be one omnipotent being. And there can only be one omnipotent being because omnipotence includes the power to render any other being powerless. So the three subjects cannot be three gods, they are three persons in one God. And when I first read that, this was probably a few months ago, I was like, wow, that is like exactly the direction I've been moving in. So to see, like an attestation of that thought process in a major theologian in the church, I was like, okay, well, that's pretty unique. And at this point, I had been, I'd already delved into communal ontology and, Trey's work. And so I was like, well, that also but sounds a lot like communal ontology, especially that bit about how the two, transcending the dyad. I know you've spoken about that, Trey. And love is also an important thing. And I was toying with the idea, love is communal. Love is communal, so it needs to have more than one subject involved. And you apply that to the Godhead, then that, again, like Cross says, it has to be, the three subjects cannot be three gods, they need to be one. And I think it's just really interesting, and since it like makes sense and follows, especially for communal ontology, I think it demonstrates, yeah, we can logically reason about this stuff. So that's my rant on my side of thinking about this stuff, and I guess I'll let that go to you now.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The way I've started, like, for example, when you talk about love in Orthodox theology, we'd say we're talking about a divine energy, right? And what we mean by divine energy is just a divine name, something you can say about God. Like you're truly getting at something about God when you say love. And the same with being, right? Because God is being. He is I am who I am, right? He is who was, is, and never shall be. So that being of God is a divine name, a divine actuality, something about God. And as Trinitarians, we believe that all of the divine properties, because they're common to the three, they exist in the communion of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That's what being is. Like when we're talking about being, I've talked about this before, it's not like something abstracted from the Trinity, but the Trinity, that's part of like the content, the wealth of life or whatever like that. See, we're just pulling at different divine names when I talk like this, but the persons of the Trinity are infinitely positive and substantial because they are everything, right? And that's why our being only is participation in them. So once you grasp that these are divine energies, now you sort of have a prima facie reason to believe that they should be Trinitarian, or you should be able to articulate why they're Trinitarian. And that's because the energies only ever subsist as Trinitarian. And it's a lot easier to show this, I think, with the energy of love, because it's more obvious why love would require multiple persons. As you said, love is almost the essence of communion. Like love is a going out of a person towards another person in self-emptying and mutual self-emptying, and ultimately meeting in the third, which is a more complex argument. And I think that's why Richard of St. Victor really focused in on the property of love, the divine energy of love. But also, I think this can be demonstrated with being itself, as I talked about in the Being as Communion video, where if you have this purely Unitarian or purely indeterminate, that is non-hypostatic, non-relational notion of being, well, Hegel points out that this is actually the conceptual equivalent of nothing at all. It's like it's the same formula of A equals A, where it's not actually saying anything. It's just this pure indeterminate self-relation, and that fits really well in with our thesis that being is communion. So what would self-relation be? It's the opposite of communion, so it should be the opposite of being, and it is. It's nothing at all. So that's the way I would approach it. It's like we're taking the revelation of the divine energies, and we are and the revelation of the Trinity as well, sort of on faith, I think, but also like I think you can work through these notions themselves, like being, like love, especially like joy, etc., and show that they actually, in order for these properties, these divine actualities, or even just these actualities themselves, because we are created in the image of God, we're analogs of God, etc., however you want to frame it. Also for us, joy has to be multi-personal. You don't ever experience joy in just absolute solitude. You're always experiencing, even just for the fact that you experience joy for a reason that isn't just identical to you. Like you're not just rejoicing in your empty self. Like that makes no sense at all. It's always rejoicing over some experience of a reality other than you. So anyways, you can take all of these properties and sort of, I think, do a sort of immanent analysis of them, like Hegel does with being, even though we don't go fully down the same path as him, and show how they have to ultimately be Trinitarian. And the greatest modern example of this, at least in the Orthodox world, is Father Demetrius Staniloae, because in The Experience of God, Volume 1, specifically the chapter Holy Trinity, Structure of Supreme Love, this is exactly what he does, right? He shows how actually the notion of a monopersonal God and even a dual personal God fails imminent by if we want to say that God is omnipotent, God is love, God is joy, etc. Even that God is self-conscious. He'll demonstrate that you can't actually have self-consciousness in pure solipsism, which is actually very intuitive, because you can think of, I use this analogy all the time, like an eyeball can't stare at itself. So like the very means of perceiving can't stare at itself. I was just reading this passage from St. Basil. I think this is pretty famous letter 38, where he talks about the difference between the hypostases, the shared nature and stuff. And he talks about how the Father knows himself eternally in the Son. And he actually, he goes on about this. And that just goes to show that this has been understood by the church for a while.
If I could add something about Richard of St. Victor. So he is really remarkable. I was listening to some Jordan Daniel Wood today, who is this excellent scholar, Maximus the Confessor, that Trey has had on before. They had a very interesting conversation about subjectivity and Gehenology and very interesting things of that sort. And I have a serious parasocial relationship with that guy, because I listen to him at length at work along with a couple of other people. But he was talking about how there really should be a greater appreciation for the kind of you could say the kind of what's the term he used? Anyway, there are a bunch of people besides Aquinas in the West that people should really be paying attention to, like the Victorines, so like Hugh of St. Victor, Richard of St. Victor, Meister Eckhart. I was actually just talking with Saro about Meister Eckhart recently. He really likes Meister Eckhart. I don't know how you can hear the phrase, the eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me, and not think, well, that's badass, dude. So yeah, there's all these figures that really should be paid attention to more.
And this
Bonaventure,
is, by the way, that is, sorry to interrupt, but that's like not like he's putting it maybe in a different way than the fathers would, but like this is what the fathers say. This is what Paul says, like you see by the Spirit, right? You know as you're known, like et cetera, et cetera. Jordan Daniel Wood talks about this a lot, but yeah, like that literally is the purpose of hesychasm. And Saint Seraphim of Sarov talks about it, where the Spirit becomes the Spirit of God himself becomes so united to you and to your spirit that your very means of spiritual perception becomes the very Spirit of God. And that's because you're becoming so united with the Logos via participation that this is a doctrine as sonship. This is how deification fits in with the Pauline doctrine of sonship. Actually, Eric Pearl, I think, he critiques Palamas, I think, for saying that theosis with the energies undermines the Pauline doctrine of adoption by sonship. But Seraphim Hamilton wrote this whole paper basically refuting that energies of the Trinity. No, it's that you receive the energies by being united to the Son in the Spirit, and that Spirit becomes your very means of, like the Son, of seeing the Father, right? That's how it works, right? Like very, very complicated, dense stuff. But I just wanted to say that
In his light, we see light.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Deep calls to deep. Like John Vervaeke's always quoting that line from the Psalms. I think Energies of the Trinity is written in response to some kind of woman scholar. I can't remember. I don't think it's Eric Pearl. I can't remember exactly her name.
He mentions Eric Pearl,
Yeah,
I think, but there is also a woman scholar.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which I don't know the name
Some
of.
sort of woman scholar.
Yeah.
Great all-heart line there. Anyway, I should shut up. Basically, join the Telos Bound Institute again because read Richard St. Victor. Anyway, who up in here?
Should I give it to Marcus, or could I ask one more thing?
Yeah,
Sure.
go for it.
This might be a more complex question. You just let me know. But you mentioned that clearly we can have a monopersonal God, and we know the issues with a dipersonal or dyadic God. And I think this is an issue that will come up and people might pose, which is, well, what about a quadrupersonal God, or a pentapersonal God, or a septupersonal God? Like, why does it have to stop at 3? Maybe you can make an Occam's razor argument, but like, is that like a bit too, I don't know, irreverent or simple for the Godhead? That's what I'm asking.
Yeah. I don't know, and it's like one of those things where it's like I think there has to be an argument that is always building off of revelation for it. So what?
I tried to take a stab at it. I might
Yes, you can,
embarrass
Marcus.
myself, but I'll do it. Okay.
Yeah, before you do though, I will just say, like, Staniloy tries to answer this question, so does Florensky, and Staniloy cites Florensky positively. So in Pillar of Ground of the Truth, Florensky has this very dense, like, logical argument with like A, B, C, and then Staniloy actually quotes it in the Experience of God, like in a footnote in support of it. It's a tough question, and I would point people to that instead of, so basically I'm not going to try and take a stab at it yet. I'd have to reread them, but I will let Marcus try to do it and possibly embarrass himself, but I'm sure he won't.
Maybe we'll find out. So okay, so if we think, so probably my favorite kind of argument in the direction of the Trinity, right, is like God's self-knowledge, right? How does God know himself, right? So obviously an eyeball can't really see itself without its projection being, in a sense, distinct from itself while still having the same content, right? So that content is what binds them, right? So if we think about, so we have like a dyadic kind of situation here, right? We have like the knower and what is known, right? Now, in order for that to be, for them to be together, right? There is a union between the two, right? And that would be this third entity, which is the union between the knower and the known, which we could say is just the knowledge, right? And we have this kind of we kind of have this, complete, you could call it a complete manifestation of the knowledge here, right? So if we were to add on like a fourth entity, right? And like, let's say we add on like another knower that participates in that kind of knowledge, right? Well, I mean, I just said that it's another knower, right? And because of that, because it's something that's already pre-contained in the relationship that we just established, right? It's not adding anything actually new to the original relation, right?
Yeah.
So
Right.
basically, if we're gonna have, and let's understand what God is, right? He is the first mover, right? He is the unmoved mover, right? He is like part of that is being complete and simple and all, but also all powerful, being able to cause everything else, right? You can't be prior to God, right? So if that is the case, right, then another knower, right, would be necessarily, it couldn't be prior to God, then it would just be God, right? So it would be something posterior to God, right? So you still have this first relation as the first principle, and you have this secondary knower as something else that maybe God created, right? I mean, what else could it be? It's posterior to God, and it couldn't be prior to God because then it would just be God, right? So I think we just kind of if we try to like add on like a fourth like person or a fifth person, whatever, right? We would basically just get an infinite regress, I think. So that's kind of my stab at the problem.
That's very cool. And I mean, Aristotle says everything that comes in threes is perfect. So I mean, there's lots of mathematical. Not to say that the three of the Trinity is the three of numerics, but I mean, there is a relationship,
Yeah,
and yeah, everything that comes in threes is perfect. There's lots of reasons to
Yeah.
think, and a book you might want to check out, Evan, if you haven't yet, and it is in the book list. It's just towards the end because it's again chronological. Is the experience of God being consciousness bliss by Hart. It's from the first half of Hart's theology career. So basically, no one objects to like the books from the first half. Really, no one objects to the beauty of the infinite. Really, I mean, no one reads that besides cool people like us, and no one really objects to the doors to the door of the sea. Or the experience of God, but he talks about that. He talks about Sat Chit Ananda, which Indian Christians use to refer to the Trinity being consciousness bliss. I mean, that's all there is. You don't need anything more than that. Creation is, I mean, contained in that. Like, so even the fourth is not a fourth in any kind of ontologically on par sense. So
Yeah.
I would check that out. You'd be into that.
Everything
Yeah.
perfect comes in threes, just like Babylon is fallen host.
So
Yes.
true.
That's true.
We got
That is so
Trey,
true.
all heart, and the copulation of the two. I mean, just the union.
No, yeah, just a union. Yeah, just purely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Henosis,
Let's see, what
henosis,
was my
not
question?
synthesis.
Oh yeah. So I was gonna, and I'm really glad Evan asked that question because my question is somewhat related, right? So he talked, he very first of all, I need to read Victor. It sounds very interesting. Um, but it was something I've kind of noticed, and to be fair, I haven't really looked into it much myself, right? But there's this attitude I kind of see in terms of like the West, right? And I'll point to one quote from John Paul II, right, who describes the Trinity as like an inscrutable mystery of God, right?
Hmm.
And there's also I can't read French, but like Eugene Clark says that God is one and God is free. Since there is nothing like this in creation, we cannot understand it, but only accept it, right? So there's this attitude of like, you can't use human reason to understand the Trinity at all, right? And I was wondering, is there like an attitude like this in the Eastern Fathers, or is this like a particularly Western thing? And if so, like, what do you know about this attitude? Because it's kind of strange considering how, like, people in the West, like Aquinas, for example, are very positive in terms of natural theology, right? And being able to understand God for nature. But when it comes to the Trinity, they just accept that as like, some like revelation, right? And it is a
Mm-hmm.
revelation. I'm not denying
Mm-hmm.
that. And the only way we know how to like reify onto these different like examples is from because it was revealed to us. But still, we can use reason to apply the principle of the Trinity to reality and better understand it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess my question is kind of like, why is that the case? Especially because, I mean, if you basically leave like the Trinity as just like a thing that comes with the Christian faith, and then you kind of just accept it, and really like what that leads to is basically we basically just become, I mean, I don't want to be mean to like any Westerners, but what I see is that we basically just adopt Neoplatonism and then just slap the Trinity on after, right? Because it just comes with the
Mm-hmm.
Christian faith. So my question is like where that comes from, and is that found in any Eastern Fathers?
I'm not sure about the history of it. I don't know if Allhard or Nate would know, but I would say that you kind of just avoid this entire problem. And I phrased this poorly in an old article, or not an old one, a recent article, where I said that I reject Thomas Aquinas's split between nature and reason and nature and grace specifically, or not nature and reason, nature and grace, and nature and revelation, or natural reason and revelation. Now, I didn't mean I reject that split entirely. I just mean it's not as dichotomous, I think, as Thomas wants to say. And I would say that if you avoid this problem completely if you take Maximus's view that there isn't like some I don't know how to phrase it, but it's like uh homologous. This is like a bad term. Like creation is homologous to the actual incarnation of Christ, or it's like in a sense very much connected to it because it's the same principle of God's free condescension beyond himself, which he does in the Logos. This is the eternal pattern of God, of course, but then with creation, he includes creation freely in himself in this condescension from the Father to the Son in the Spirit. So you avoid this if you see nature as in itself an incarnation, a revelation of God, a free self-condescension of God, so that it's not like the Trinity is present all the way down, because it's like that it's a Trinitarian act. Creation itself is a Trinitarian act. Obviously, it's not a essential Trinitarian act, right? It's a free, energetic, we could say, Trinitarian act.
A free
Yeah.
expression of
Mm-hmm.
his energy.
Mm-hmm. But I apologize, guys. I do need to go now. I apologize. But I'm not sure how much longer you guys want to stay. But thank you guys for joining us here in the Telespan Institute, and thank you to everyone who watched. I'm going to let Allhart and Nate close off and answer whatever other questions or comments anyone else has. But I'm heading out now. But I had a great time. Good night. Thank you,
God
guys.
bless, bro.
Good night,
Thank you
bro.
for answering
Peace.
my question.
07. Yeah, of course. Of course. Bye-bye.
And then there were two.
It's no longer perfect, bro.
Yeah.
Hey,
Man,
I can fill in.
that's true. You're a sub
It's
at
over for you.
Telos Bound Babylon is Fallen host. Some points on. I think that's one of Thomas's most cold takes, is the idea that there's basically the Trinity is some kind of extrinsic proposition to the system of possible human knowledge discovered by reason. That seems very strange to me, and it's
Lame.
not.
Yeah.
It's super lame, and it's not even like the Western view, because, well, Eriugena, who we're going to cover in the book club, totally denies that. He thinks philosophy and theology properly construed are the same thing, basically. So, and he knew Maximus well, and he knew Augustine well. So that position is much more sympathetic to me, I think. And yeah, and it relates to some other stuff, like much has been made in the 20th century about how Thomas really isn't as much of a Thomist as people tend to think. I mean, that was the whole dispute about, Henri de Lubac, the French theologian, ressourcement theologian, who was like, hey, all this hard and fast nature and supernature stuff that you think is in Thomas with your manualist Thomism isn't actually there, bro. And there's been a good work recently that John Vervaeke really likes by a guy named Sebastian Morello, who is he was a student of Roger Scruton, and he is also a Thomas scholar, and he just wrote a book on Thomas Aquinas and Neoplatonism a few years ago, which everyone who's interested in Thomas Aquinas should check out, because that is like one of the hottest things off the press at the moment regarding Thomistic scholarship. But there is some seeds of this hard and fast nature grace split in Aquinas that are there, and I think that you just have pointed us to one of them, Marcus. This idea that the Trinity is a purely extrinsic proposition to the possible sphere of human rational knowledge, which is, yeah, really weird. And again, like, not even a universal Western view. As for and I think when you mentioned John Paul II, some other people who just kind of say, well, it's the Trinity, so like throw your hands up in the air, and we don't know anything about that. Like that I think they are just getting from Thomas. Because I don't even think, if you read like Augustine's De Trinitate, he's writing De Trinitate. Like, that's not on his mind in the way that he seems to be making arguments for why this is the case. Anyway, but yeah, we should probably not linger too long without our third part of this our third musketeer.
I gotta wake up in
same, bro.
6 hours.
Same.
To hit the hay soon.
Yeah. You can go to bed, and it's been a pleasure. I'm gonna see if it'll blow up the whole thing if I just check. I've been added. Yeah. Yo, great stuff, Dave. And yeah, so we'll have all the PDFs in the Telespan Institute VIP book club forum thing very soon. Dave just picked up the first book in hard copy, so we'll have links to hard copies and PDFs there. Just checking something. Did you mention the Latin anagram vis-a-vis Pilate? I missed the first 30 minutes of the stream. Woody asked me that. Do you know what he's talking about, Nate? Okay, we do not.
Yes, I know what he's talking about because he put it in the chat. He said, in John 18:38, Pontius Pilate asked Christ, what is truth in Latin? It's quid est veritas. The anagram statement of the question is est vir qui adest, which means he who is standing before you. So, interior to the question, in the anagram of the question, there is the admission that the one standing before Pilate is Christ. And Woody Woo takes this to mean that Pilate cognized Christ as the unblemished lamb, and this ties into Tertullian's intuition of Pilate's subtle conversion.
Very cool. Woody Woo always with the best additions. And with that testament to Woody Woo's wizardry, I think we'll end the stream here. Babylon has fallen, Christ is risen. Come back for next time. Get in the Telespan server. The Institute is going to be popping off now. Just subscribe $5 to Trey, and I think similar. I think maybe Seraphim's lowest tier is 10. I can't remember, but anyway, if you are a Patreon supporter of either Telespan or Seraphim Hamilton, you get into the Institute, you get a bunch of free PDFs, and you get in on the book club and lots of other cool stuff. If you submit at higher tiers, you're going to be able to write articles for a future publication, and we'll be in a common dialogue about these various interesting things we get into because of this book club. We'll be discussing the same things, have the same things on the mind. It will be a really excellent experience, I think. It already is very high IQ and cool. Absolutely. Let's ecstatically unite.